There have been massive protests across some of the biggest cities from Shanghai, Beijing, Wuhan. It's the biggest protest we've seen in China since 1989 in Tiananmen. Selena, what exactly are the factors that are fueling these protests?
We are witnessing an extraordinary, a historic moment, and what we are seeing is pent-up anger over 3 years of this draconian lockdown that has upended people's livelihoods, their lives. There have been countless stories of people struggling and dying in these lockdowns because they can't get enough food, essentials, or emergency help when they're in a sealed-off building. But what really catalyzed this nationwide wave of rage is a deadly fire that broke out in the far west region of Xinjiang. Videos online showed a high apartment building on a high floor. A fire is blazing with smoke coming from the building, but fire trucks appear to be delayed and hampered from getting close enough to the scene because of COVID restrictions. The video shows metal barriers and fences that are frequently used when buildings are locked down. Other video shows the water coming from the fire trucks not actually hitting the building. That was a stark reminder to the population that could have been any of us living here, trapped in a sealed-off lockdown building, unable to get out, unable to get help. That was really the straw that broke the camel's back this time. But it's not just that isolated case. It is countless heartbreaking stories that have come before the fires in Xinjiang, and people who are just tired and fed up with the zero COVID policies that have not allowed people to live a normal life in China for 3 years.
And what's been the larger impact of this zero COVID policy on China's economic health? After all, it is the second largest economy in the world. Why are the Chinese authorities continuing with it, persisting with it?
This zero COVID policy has hit virtually every part of the economy. It has devastated consumer confidence, business confidence. Countless small businesses have had to shut down. It's incredibly difficult for even the most large and sophisticated corporations to operate under a myriad of COVID rules. We saw unrest at the Foxconn factory just these past few weeks because they've been dealing with a COVID outbreak, and China has this closed loop rule, which means that those factory workers have to live, work, sleep on site. That's costly and difficult to manage. And the workers were complaining about the unsanitary conditions and living quality at that closed loop system in the factory. So the question is, why is China continuing with the zero COVID policy? Now, there's a lot of factors to this. The party has been repeating over and over again that zero COVID is successful. It's prevented China from experiencing the mass waves of deaths that we've seen in other parts of the world, millions of deaths in other countries. China says their policy is putting people's lives above all else. And they point to the elderly population that is still vulnerable. They have a lagging vaccination rate, although it is another question as to why they haven't boosted that rate of vaccination for the elderly population. They also point to the uneven healthcare resources in China. There are still many places in rural China where the health care resources would not be able to deal with an influx of COVID patients.
All right, Selena Wong, live for us tonight in Beijing. Thanks very much for joining us indeed. Let's bring you up to speed with these pictures. Where are we getting these pictures from? It's not just small towns. It's across the biggest cities of China, from Beijing to Shanghai, Wuhan. And it all started, as Selena said a moment ago, what happened in Urumqi, in Xinjiang, where a bunch of people were trapped inside a quarantined building. The building caught on fire. Firefighters were not able to get to that building because it was a COVID zone. This, of course, is also popular anger and frustration at Xi Jinping and the ruling Communist Party's zero COVID strategy. Remember, China has this strict zero COVID strategy at a time when the rest of the world, including, countries like Qatar, are hosting the World Cup right now. So Chinese citizens have been seeing this in their television screens and asking questions of their government as to why don't we have anything like a normal life. And then, of course, in Beijing as well as in Shanghai, overnight, that's Saturday night and Sunday night, you had cops and protesters, sometimes even coming to blows. In Beijing, of course, it was in the Liangmahe part of town. It's central Chaoyang district in Beijing. In Shanghai, too, they were protesting at a street named after Urumqi, the provincial capital of Xinjiang, which is where the protests started off from. So clearly, it seems like a bit of a watershed moment, if you will. China has not seen this scale of protests and this breadth of protests across cities since the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. Let me now go across to our guests who are joining us on the broadcast this evening. Professor Brahmachalani, strategic affairs expert. Aina Tangent is a political affairs commentator. Atul Malhotra is a former diplomat and Indian foreign policy expert, and will also be joined by Victor Gao, who is a former foreign ministry spokesperson in Beijing and now currently the chair professor at Soochow University. Brahmachalani, let me start with you first. China is not a place that is used to or has seen this kind of mass scale of protests. How much of this is a reflection of people being sick and tired of the zero COVID policy, and how much of this is anger against the ruling establishment?
The popular uprising is a watershed moment for China, as you rightly called it. The protests in China may have been triggered by the harsh COVID-related lockdowns, but they have snowballed into anti-Xi Jinping and anti-Communist Party demonstrations. The protesters have openly demanded democracy and freedom. They've also been holding blank sheets of paper. Blank sheets of paper have become a symbol against government restrictions on speaking out against repressive policies. The protests are remarkable and also unprecedented, given that China has a record of imposing severe punishment on protesters, including handing them long jail sentences. It takes immense courage to participate in protests in China. In the current protests, many have been arrested by police. And in the coming days and weeks, the security forces are going to use the country's surveillance system, which relies on facial recognition technology, to arrest more people. Yet the protests not only continue, and this is remarkable, not only do they continue, but they have spread to most cities. The protests hold larger international implications, as underlined by the fall today in stock futures and oil price. The protests, after all, could exacerbate China's economic slowdown. But the implications of the protests for the future of communist rule in China are ominous. Not only are the protests spreading in China, but also new COVID infections are surging in the country. And the surge in COVID cases compounds Xi Jinping's zero-tolerance approach to COVID-19.
So let me ask Aina Tangent that. It's not just about protesting against the zero-COVID policy, but many of these people, young people, coming out and showing blank pieces of paper. People are calling this the A4 revolution, white flowers, basically against the state, not allowing them to express themselves. So it's not just against zero COVID, but it's also a protest against the ruling party and its policies of clamping down on these protests, clamping down on what people think of zero COVID and how badly it's affected their lives.
Well, you may well state so, but I don't think that's the real situation. If you look early in during COVID, the government had a 95% approval rating for their handling. But after 3 years, after seeing, as you pointed out in the report, people unmasked, watching football, people just don't know. They don't read the science. They just think, well, I should be free. Well, freedom comes at a price. It's called responsibility. And if you live in a society, your individual freedoms affect others, health, safety. You might want to go out and run around and shoot off a gun, but do that in a crowded area, you're going to kill people. So this idea that somehow they're being blocked from the freedom is nonsense. What it comes down to is frustration. A lot of social media, false. There was a picture of some doors wired shut, and the person behind it was saying that these were the doors to the high-rise in Urumqi. There wasn't. It was just fake. So you're seeing a lot of dialogue right now where countries that did not do as well with COVID are saying, oh, gee whiz, it was never stoppable. The politicians who made faulty decisions weren't at fault because there's nothing that can be done. China does have to adjust. They do. There was an issue. What they were doing is they said a zero COVID policy, but they were allowing these residential units in China. They have very large neighborhoods that are built by one developer, and they're under one kind of community control. And they were allowing these groups to make the rules as to what was going to happen when there's a COVID threat. Unfortunately, a lot of them were by elderly people who decided it was safest just to take the most draconian measures possible. And as a result, now you see that's changing. You've seen a number of reports from Xinhua and others where the government has said, you guys have to be much more humane and careful and assess the situation and be appropriate.
Okay.
You can't have one person in a 10,000 person community has COVID and decide to shut down the whole thing. So they're intervening. But I do agree with what Fauci said. There's an issue about getting more people vaccinated, especially the elderly, getting more Paxlovid online. So when they
what's
do
the
open
end
up, they
game?
have
I mean, what is your exit strategy? I don't think that is clear, or at least certainly the Chinese government has not made that exit strategy clear. Let me go to Victor Gao, as former spokesperson of the foreign ministry. We've had these unprecedented protests. We're seeing it in the biggest cities, in Beijing, in Shanghai. It may be a few hundred, but like I was asking Aina Tangent, they're just not protesting against the zero COVID policy and how badly it's affected their normal lives. They're also showing blank pieces of paper, basically protesting against the state and the state not allowing them to express themselves. What do you think this is a reflection of by the Chinese people? Because as numerous speakers before you said, protests are very, very rare in China. We haven't had one of this scale since '89 in Tiananmen.
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, it is very rare in China to have such large-scale protests taking place, not in one city, but in quite a few cities.
Mm-hmm.
And I do hope the Chinese government authorities will take immediate action to get to the bottom of the situation and heed the legitimate concerns expressed by the protesters to the extent possible, and also will do their best to make sure that the protests do not spread around in the country. Now, the second point worthy emphasizing is that the protests are very much focused on how to lift the restrictions imposed by the dynamic zero COVID policy, which China has been practicing for 3 years. Now, in this way, we need to be philosophical because on the one hand, China has achieved the highest success in this regard by saving as many people as possible from dying from COVID and as many people as possible from getting infections from COVID, even at great cost to the Chinese economy and to the Chinese society at large. But now I think the Chinese government is already in the middle of making a transition from the original orthodox version of the dynamic zero COVID policy to a more flexible version of the policy, which need to accommodate two goals. One is still minimizing deaths, minimizing infections, but on the other hand, to achieve normalcy for daily life and economic activities for China as a whole. I think this transition period is difficult, but I do believe the Chinese nation will be able to unite together to go through this transition period with minimum hiccups.
Achal Malhotra, when Chinese people are sitting at home, locked in, watching, let's say, the Football World Cup, and they're looking at these stadiums of 20 and 30 and 50,000 people not wearing masks, it sort of gives them the impression that, look, the rest of the world has moved on from COVID. If the World Cup can be hosted in Qatar, why are Chinese people still living as though it's 2020? That's a valid grievance to have.
Yes, Zaka, because you see, the point is Xi and the communist authorities in China appear to have gone too far in trying to control COVID. The zero COVID policy, the way it is being implemented, it is good in principle to have a zero COVID scenario, but to achieve it, the kind of measures which have been taken, obviously they are testing the patience of the people. And as you mentioned, if they see everybody else leading a normal life, whether it is in Qatar, USA, India, or elsewhere in the world, for 3 years they are being forced. So there is a theory of elasticity. There is a point, there is a breaking point, and that point has come. And these 3 years have caused a lot of socio-economic fallout of the zero COVID policy. What remains to be seen is, will there be a political fallout now?
Yep.
Will this trigger the kind of protest? Do they have the potential or the capacity to ultimately, to evolve into a revolution or uprising against the government? will there be a repeat of the 1989
Hmm.
and how the government is going to then tackle it? Most probably, if there is a spread, because these protests are always infectious. You saw they started with one city and they are now spread all over China.
Okay.
And if they go on at this rate, obviously China will at some point of time have to use very strong. So far, I think they have been more or less controlled in a peaceful manner by and large. But ultimately, probably they will have to come and start using force, and then we are heading for once again a very damaging scenario in China. I mean, it's
Professor
all of
Brahmacharani,
trash.
one of the things that commentators are also pointing out too is that, none of these protesters are asking for greater democracy or a change of one-party rule. What they're asking for is, getting back to a semblance of a normal life, something that we all had before 2020. Much as, there were slogans against Xi Jinping and the Communist Party rule, he's just secured a historic, unprecedented third term. What are the chances that these protests, which are happening across cities now, will lead to some kind of a political fallout?
Authoritarian regimes look strong until simmering discontent at the grassroots levels breaks out into mass protests against those in power. So the Chinese Communist regime of Xi Jinping does look strong. And certainly he looked very strong a month ago when he secured a third term. But now these protests have shaken the very foundations of his regime. After all, the protesters have been chanting slogans like Xi Jinping, leave, leave, and Communist Party, out, out. I mean, this is so daring, given the fact that participating in